I just want to start off by thanking you for coming here and speaking to us today.
Oh, pleasure. Okay.
I remember earlier in the presentation you talked about a relation between taxation and hours worked.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if that implies that a tax rate close to 0% is optimal, or if we go further along, we get a relation similar to kind of a Laffer Curve situation.
Okay, good. All right, so very good question. So you said a couple of things. You said optimal and you said Laffer Curve. Okay, so let me pick up on both of those points. So first of all, if you're going to have government, you got to fund it. There's no question you have to fund it. So the question is, what's the most efficient way to fund it? And then the second thing is how much government? Because if you have a lot of government, you're going to have high average tax rates, not necessarily high income tax rates, but you're going to have high tax on something, right? So when you say optimal, if you said, well, is the optimal tax rate 0? If we thought of that as the tax rate for the whole economy, of course, that would mean we had no revenue, and then we would have no government. So we wouldn't even have the stuff, even stuff that, you know, libertarians, the ones that small government people would say, well, we got to have national defense or something like that. You couldn't even fund that. So the optimal size of the government, very few people would say the optimal size of the government is 0. Okay, so that's why I pick up on that. Now, he mentioned something called the Laffer Curve. How many people know what the Laffer Curve is? Okay, most of you, half of you know what the Laffer Curve is. The Laffer Curve is the relationship between the tax rate and the amount of revenue that you take in. So let me give you two extremes. Suppose that the tax rate were 0. How much revenue would you get? 0. Suppose the tax rate were 100%. How much revenue would you get? Okay, probably 0. Why? Who said 0? Why? Okay, go ahead. No one would work, no one would do it. If everything you do gets taxed away, no one's going to work. They won't work. Okay. So basically, if the tax rate is 0, if the tax rate is 100, you get no revenue. If the tax rate is, say, 40%, you're going to get some revenue. So it's hard to do this in the air, but let me do it, okay? So you have one dot here at 0, one dot here at 0, and you know in the middle, you have positive, right? So what do you get? If you connect the 3 dots, you get an inverted U. That's it. So that's the Laffer curve. Now, the Laffer curve was kind of a nice way to package the notion that taxes create negative incentives and might even cost you government revenue. But it's a little bit too strong from my point of view. And the reason is this. If you went to the point on that inverted U, on that upside down U, where you maximized revenue, would that be optimal? So now let me come back to Hans's first word, optimal. Would that be optimal? Why not? Anybody say that's not optimal? Why not? Any ideas? Go ahead. Yeah, please. Right. The goal, very good. So what he said was that could be too high a spending level. The goal is not to maximize the size of the government. The goal is to maximize the welfare of the people in the society, okay? And so even if you can get more revenue, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should raise taxes. An argument for lowering taxes, if you were past that point, and if you could get revenue to go up, then you should surely lower it. Why? Because if you lower the taxes, that makes everybody better off, but it also raises government revenue. That's a no-brainer. The point is, you might even want to lower it beyond that. In fact, most economists would say you do want to lower it beyond that. You don't want to be at the point that maximizes government revenue. So really good points, because you got both of those things in there. Okay, very good. Let me see. Oh, man, lots of questions. You haven't said anything. Let me take you.
It's on. Okay. So I was wondering if I kind of have a two-part question. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the displacement of certain low-skilled labor with AI, and whether or not we should kind of, if that's going to be the case, if we should follow Denmark's lead in establishing a more robust worker displacement program.
Okay, very good. All right, so 2 points. One is AI going to be a problem? 2, what do you do about it? Denmark is one example. Okay, answer is right now our problem is the reverse. AI is not the problem. The problem is not that we have productivity growth that's too high. It's actually that productivity growth is too low. So you remember I showed you that picture and I said, we get that little turn up at the end there. We're hoping that'll continue. But the people who are worried about AI are essentially saying what we're worried about is we'll have so much productivity growth that it'll displace humans, in particular, not every human, but the low-skilled humans, okay? That may be a problem down the road. It's certainly not today's problem. So it could be a problem a decade from now or 2 decades from now. It's not today's problem. The answer, I think, and you said, is Denmark the right solution to it? I'd say no, and I'll tell you why. At best, those transfer programs are short-run solutions. They don't fix the problem. What they do is they essentially put a Band-Aid on the problem, and they say, you've got people who are displaced. What do we do with those people? Most of the problem in the American labor market today is not that people are displaced. It's not 50-year-olds or 60-year-olds who lost their jobs and can't get reskilled. There is that for sure, but that's a tiny fraction of the labor that's having trouble. Most of it is the Elvis Presley scenario, the one with the kids who don't have the skills to succeed in the labor market. So what I've been arguing, and I have argued this in a number of op-eds and based on data, real data, that I have a former student who's in Germany, and we looked at German data versus US data. And we know that Germany and Switzerland and Austria have very good vocational training programs. Now, they go to the extreme. They start very young, at age 12, you decide whether you're going to be vocational or not. That's probably not a good idea. But one of the good things about their system is that it produces skills in people that are actually valuable when they get into the labor force. And by the way, when you think about vocational, most people, when they say vocational, they're thinking plumbers and pipe fitters and welders, and there is some of that, manufacturing, there is some of that. But remember, Germany's economy is 70% services. It's mostly services. So what most of these guys are being trained for, the kids in Germany who go to vocational schools are being trained for service jobs for the most part. Some of them are manufacturing, but many of them are service jobs. So these would be things like, hotel management or being a lab tech. I ran into some kids. I always love to tell this story because it's the extreme, but it's interesting. I ran into some kids, and they were. I started talking with them. I'm completely fluent in English, and I happened to be on a ski lift, and it was in Switzerland. And I said, "What are you guys doing out? I only come skiing when you guys are in school." And they said, but that's because we go to the vocational school. And I said, oh yeah, what are you training to be? And they said, physicist assistants. And I said, oh really? And they said, yeah. I said, well, what do you take? And they said, well, right now we're taking physics, obviously, and we're taking, calculus and so forth. Why? So these were the elite. And I said, well, what will you earn? And they said, well, typically, when people who have these jobs, when they're at their peak, would earn somewhere between 100 and 130,000 Swiss francs a year, okay? So these are pretty good paying jobs. You're talking about, this is not low-level stuff. These are pretty good paying jobs. Point is, again, this was the extreme. They were the top of the distribution. This is not everybody. But the point that I want you to take from this is that the problem that we face is that when our kids go to high school and they don't then go on to college, the skills that they get are not very well suited to the labor market. So if you think about your classmates who didn't go to college, and you all have some of them that you know, what were they doing? Well, the high school was trying to get them to learn Algebra 1 by the time they were seniors. What's Algebra 1 going to do for them? In most cases, nothing. So the point was they didn't have skills that were relevant in the labor force, and my view is that that's the major problem. We're running out of time. I'll take one more question. Yeah, please. Oh, wait a minute. I'm going to take 2 because I didn't get it. You had your hand up at the same time, so I'll take yours as well. Let me take his first, and then I'll get yours.
Could you share 1 or 2 ideas for to improve immigration system?
Yeah. All right. So my view is this: we have to have much more balanced immigration, and what I mean by balance is our current system is unfair. Why is it unfair? Well, if you come from Mexico or El Salvador, you actually have a pretty good, especially El Salvador, because you got a million people here, 6 million there. There's a pretty good chance that you're going to have a family member here. If you come from, Ethiopia, where I just was recently, the chances of you getting into the United States is almost zero. So that's not exactly a fair system, and it doesn't necessarily maximize anything. So if you go back to that list that I gave you, that probably wouldn't be a great system. So I'll tell you what I thought was a pretty good system. We had a bill, when I was in the government, there was a bill that President Bush, who was a pro-immigration president, pro-immigration Republican, and the late Senator Ted Kennedy got together, and they drafted a bill that almost passed, came close, but didn't quite make it. And that was a pretty good bill. It had a much better balance. It did emphasize skills more. It emphasized entrepreneurship more. It also still allowed for family reunification. Obviously, you want to have family reunification. But those were weights that were emphasized more. It's closer to the Canadian system than it is to our current system. That would probably be not only better in terms of our welfare, native-born welfare, but it would also be something that would be a fairer system and more open than the current system that we have. So, yes, ma'am, you had one more. That was your question. Oh, okay, all right. So you're dying to ask a question. Should I let him ask a question? You're going to harass him after? Yeah? All right, okay. Yeah, all right, go ahead. Okay. One more, and then we'll let you go to break. Yeah.
So Andrea Cato actually gave a very similar speech to what you did.
Okay.
Showing the relationships between government spending and spending and GDP growth.
Yep.
And then I brought up the idea that time, so I'm going to bring it up to you. If you did another graph of GDP per capita and spending, you'll see a positive relationship. GDP, pretty strong.
GDP per capita?
Mm-hmm. Just without not the growth of it, but just it in general, and then government spending.
GDP per capita. So levels, yes, absolutely. That's for sure. Okay, yeah. It just took me a second. Okay, so what he's saying is you can't afford to have a big welfare state unless you're rich. That's kind of another way to put it. So when you say GDP per capita, what he's basically saying is how rich is the country? High GDP, but you know what's the highest GDP per capita countries in the world? Where would you guess? What would you guess? Close. Luxembourg is high. Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Monaco, okay? So they're very rich countries, and they could also afford if they wanted to, but Denmark, the Scandinavian countries are really better examples. Those are wealthy countries, historically have been wealthy countries. Norway had oil wealth. They could afford, they chose as a policy to have a big government with big transfers. That was a policy decision. Again, you can agree with that, you can disagree with that, but that's their policy decision. A country that's poor can't possibly do that. So again, if you visit countries in Africa and you say, are they going to have high government spending? They simply can't afford to do it. That's why the relationship that you're talking about holds. That's with respect to levels, not with respect to growth. So if you're saying, do rich countries have more spending per person than small countries? Answer is yes. Question is, does more spending then correlate with subsequent high growth or subsequent low growth? Answer is subsequent low growth, okay? So it costs Denmark, it costs Sweden, it costs Norway. Again, they may say it's worth it, but it definitely costs them in terms of subsequent growth. Okay? All right, I better stop there. Thanks. Hope I gave you guys something to talk about at dinner. So.